Hi, welcome to the video lesson for standard H1. This is the standard for nationalism in Africa. And on the agenda for this lesson, we're going to take a look at what Africa was like before the Europeans arrived. Why did Europeans come to Africa? What the impact of slavery was. Which Europeans took over Africa? The consequences of dividing Africa. So let's start with what Africa was like before the Europeans arrived. To be honest, there was not just one way that Africa was. There was a lot of different ways. People tend to think more stereotypically that Africa was just a bunch of small tribes, but that wasn't necessarily the case. There was large cities even before the Europeans arrived. But you also had your small farmers, your nomads, which were people who moved from place to place. So there was a lot of different things going on and different ways people lived before the Europeans arrived. One of the most interesting things, unfortunately, it was dropped from our standards, but there was a lot of really famous empires of Africa that kind of get pushed to the side in history. And unfortunately, it's happened in the state of Georgia. But great leaders like Mansa Musa or Sundiata of great empires like Mali and the Ghana empires, they were also going along before this happened, before the Europeans came. So Africa before the Europeans came was a lot of different things, just like I said. This picture is showing kind of a map of where a lot of large kingdoms and tribes were. This is just a small sampling of what it was like. There was a lot more than this, but here are the major tribes and major empires. Why did the Europeans come to Africa? The first reason why that we're going to look at is they wanted to bypass Muslim traders. They wanted to get around them. Why? Well, Europeans really wanted to get to India and China, and you can see that on this little picture here. There was a lot of different trade routes, but right in the center, you'll notice that that's what today is called the Middle East. It's what we've already covered. And the Middle East was in between Europe and the place where the Europeans wanted to go, India and China. That means in order to trade between those two, Europeans had to take their goods, give it to Muslim traders. Those Muslim traders would then have to take it to India and China. So really, the Europeans wanted another way. They wanted another way around this because they had to pay the Muslim traders quite a bit of money to take their goods and ship it on. So they wanted to eliminate the middleman. So really, at first, the explorers just saw Africa as being in the way. The first Europeans to start to explore Africa, they really started to realize that maybe Africa just wasn't in the way. It actually had a lot of resources. They were interested in the wildlife of Africa. It was much different than any other place they'd seen. And they were also very interested in the natural resources of Africa. So these explorers would go off and they would try to find these resources. And they would try to, if they found them, it would almost be like finding a gold mine. And sometimes, like I said, it was a gold mine that they were after, or they were looking for a diamond mine or other valuable resources that Africa had. Some of those raw materials, raw resources were going to be used in something called the Industrial Revolution. And this was a period that started in England that really started to use machines more, started using automated processes and factories to create goods much quicker than ever before. The only problem was that you needed more raw materials in order to make things in these factories. Some of these raw materials would be like cotton, rubber, which actually comes from a tree, ivory, which sadly comes from elephant tusk, and other minerals not really found in Europe. Missionaries were kind of it seemed like a good and bad thing. Today we think of missionaries as going and being helpful. It's looked at as a little bit of good and bad today. One thing missionaries wanted to do is they wanted to convert Africans to Christianity, but that wasn't all that they saw their mission as. They wanted Africans to be like Europeans as well, to be able to sew, knit, like this first picture, and then also to wear European clothing and abandon their what they considered savage lifestyles to be more European-like, and they thought that was to be more European-like was to be more Christian. They tried to end slavery, which was certainly a good thing. The slave trade, they thought, the missionaries thought was a horrible thing, and they wanted to end that. But they also wanted to end a part of the African culture, which is, of course, often considered very bad. So really, like I said earlier, the first reason that Europeans started to venture in and around Africa is because they wanted to get to Asia. And a lot of the first explorers were taking small little steps. Like you learned last year, people like Prince Henry the Navigator would work their way around. Not him himself, but he would pay for explorers to go around the coast of Africa, trying to find their way to India and to China. These would first start off as little posts that they would set up, little, trading posts, and it started to get a little bit more serious as they started to venture inside of Africa. Unfortunately, when they started to colonize more around the world, there was a need for free or cheap labor, and slavery is unfortunately something that started. The weird thing about slavery is a lot of people didn't know this. It existed in Africa way before the Europeans came to Africa, and it was happening all over the world in different ways. There was a lot of difference in what slavery was then and then after the Europeans came. Before the Europeans came, it was not as harsh. The slaves could actually earn their freedom. And usually before the Europeans came, if two tribes were going to war and one of those sides lost, as a reward, the side that won got to keep or have these slaves. But it wouldn't be necessarily a permanent thing. They would have to earn their freedom. Or if like another battle would happen or another fight between the two tribes, then they could earn back their freedom that way. After the Europeans came, slavery was now for life. They were, of course, not in the general area, but they were shipped to places like North and South America, the Caribbean. And when that happened, North and South America that they were sent to, diseases oftentimes killed many more slaves than the harsh work. We're going to take a look at some of these images. And this would be the boarding process. Sometimes, and most of the times, African tribes would capture these slaves like before the Europeans came, but then they would take them to the European traders. They started off being Dutch and Portuguese, and they would sell them to the Portuguese traders. They would give them things like oftentimes guns, just trinkets, pots and pans, just things that Africans wouldn't have seen before. And they would store them where they could. And this is one of the saddest parts of it. They were many people as possible into a small space. Here by a diagram that, the real tragedy that people were completely looking over the fact that this was a human being that they were trying to trade. In the New World, sometimes a sickness would happen on the boat, but if everybody made it safely, then they were taken often to a middleman who would take the slaves and buy them directly off the dock, or they would be taken directly to a slave auction. And the triangle trade started with the Europeans, and the Europeans would bring manufactured goods, trinkets, guns, weapons, all different types, to Africa, where the African slaves, or sometimes they would just capture slaves that happened to be on near the coast. There was all different types of ways they did this, but most of the time it was a trade from another African tribe for people. And then those people, those enslaved Africans, would be going to the New World. And it kind of points to the United States, but most of the people would be going to the Caribbean or South America. And then once the slaves were auctioned off, raw materials were brought back to Europe, where they could be used to create more manufactured goods. And the process would just keep going. Which Europeans took over. If the Europeans weren't bad enough in what they were doing, when Africa finally started to become a place that the Europeans wanted to look after and wanted to obtain all the resources from, there was something called the Scramble of Africa that took place. And all these European countries were trying to get as many and as much colonies and land as possible in Africa. And they actually met in a convention, and they would actually take a big map of Africa and just pick out places that they wanted to go and wanted to claim. And many of the people have never even been in these areas of Africa before, and they had no idea what they were getting, and not really theirs to get, but they were claiming it. So essentially, the reason why I have a little kindergartner with a crayon, has a crayon, they were about as intelligent and were putting as much thought into it as a kindergartner would be. They had no idea what they were doing. They were just taking a crayon to a map and claiming whatever they wanted. European politicians created these borders, and this was actually in Berlin. This is where it occurred. And African empires then shifted and became European colonies. So this was just a whole process of getting bad to worse. But finally, when the African countries gained their independence, they decided to keep the borders that a lot of these Europeans had created. Unfortunate problem with that. When this happened, this is the consequences of partitioning. It split up about 250 different ethnic groups, tribes. It would put some together. It would split others up. Tribes that wouldn't like each other, or splitting up families into different countries. And the Europeans had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know the consequences of what they were doing. And after the Europeans left, this tension created civil war, because one group or one country would want to be a part of the other, or one group in the country, one ethnic group in the country wouldn't like the other, and they would tend to fight each other. This is kind of a map of kind of all the ethnic groups in Africa. And I believe this is Kenya. Yeah, this is Kenya. And you can see all the different ethnic groups that kind of were crammed together and pushed together, and it created a huge amount of tension. And they said, pretty much, now you got to live together, and it didn't go. One of the major players in the colonial push was the British Empire. They weren't just in Africa, they were an empire that stretched across the world. And you can see this is a map of the world, and all the red parts are places that the British Empire took over. Of course, it wasn't just the British. So you can see here all the different European countries, and basically when they got out their crayons and they just drew over whatever they wanted, this is what they claimed. I call this little graphic Road to Instability. You can kind of see it started off with the Europeans set up trading posts along the African coast. Then the Europeans increased the slave trade in Africa. European explorers started to scout for resources. The Berlin Conference set up artificial borders in Africa for European colonies. European missionaries stopped slavery but changed the African culture. African countries then gained their independence, and that led to ethnic group tension and power struggles, which caused civil wars. Now, one thing that started to rise up when the African countries got their independence was dictatorships. And a dictatorship, of course, is when one person controls everything in a country. Controls the economy, controls the army, controls everything. And oftentimes this would create something called the dictator vacuum. And this is a cycle. So we're going to start off with a new dictator comes into power. And of course, a dictator doesn't rule very well. They don't really care about their people, and that leads to bad things. They're corrupt, and the people don't like them. So the people say, you're out, dictator. We don't like you anymore. And they overthrow the government, and they overthrow the dictator. Okay, well, that is creates a very unstable government. A government with no leadership. And the people now look for new leadership. Where's that leadership going to come from? And then, unfortunately, it comes from a new dictator. And this cycle went over and over and over and over again until things like democracy finally made their way in and realized that, well, dictators aren't the best way to do things.